So, hi, and welcome to Poetry Passages. I'm Clifford Rames, and boy, am I excited to be here today. I have the distinct honor and privilege to speak with Peter Heller today, who is an acclaimed and best-selling novelist and a man that I admire immensely and had the great fortune of meeting earlier this year. Um, so, again, Peter Heller, my special guest today. Hi, Peter.
Hi, Cliff. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I know you are. Are you traveling at the moment? It looks like you're someplace.
I'm in Mexico, and I'm here 3 weeks just writing and surfing.
Oh wow,
Two of
awesome.
my favorite things.
How's the surf been? It's been good to you.
Oh, it's been good. Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, amazing.
so is
Had a
that
few good swells.
Pacific Coast or
Yep,
Gulf?
we're
Yeah.
in Guerrero, sort of north of Acapulco,
Oh
and
sweet,
yeah.
awesome, cool. Well, I know you don't do a whole lot of interviews, but so this is a really special treat for me, and I hope for our listeners. And I've been a fan for so long, ever since I kind of randomly picked up a copy of the Dog Stars in Barnes and Noble 12 years ago, and it changed my life, man. So thank you.
Oh, wow. Now that's one reason to write. If we're ever sitting there wondering why the heck we're doing it, it's
Right.
what you just said.
So let me just get the official part out of the way, and then we'll get down to it. So just a little more about Peter Heller. Peter is primarily known as a novelist, but he is also a longtime contributor to NPR and a former contributing editor at Outside Magazine, Men's Journal, and National Geographic. He is an award-winning adventure writer and the author of 4 books of literary nonfiction. In addition, he is the author of 8 books of fiction, making that 12 books altogether, including his latest novel, which is fresh off the presses, Burn, which came out in August 13th on my birthday, which was quite a gift for me. And his books routinely make the bestseller list and earn accolades and awards. So, Peter, congratulations on the new book. And
Oh,
um,
thanks so much. Yeah.
did I get everything there right? Or I know
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you're far more
That sounds good.
complex than that, but
Oh, sounds great.
sounds great. Cool.
Thank you.
So Peter and I met for the first time at the Strand bookstore in New York City this August during his book tour for Burn. And knowing that Peter is an avid outdoorsman and kayaker and fisherman, I nervously handed him a haiku that I had written and gave it to him as a gift. So, because I know Peter loves poetry, and we're gonna really talk about that in a moment. But because I think Poetry Passages fans are wondering why I would be talking to a novelist today. And I'm going to put you on the spot and maybe let you answer that quickly. Why am I talking to a novelist today, Peter?
Yeah. Well, poetry was always my first love. My dad was reading poetry to me when I was tiny. He was
Yeah.
reading E. Cummings to me when I was 6, uh, which is sort of grounds for social services. I mean, a lot of the poems are super bawdy. I didn't understand them, but what I loved was the sound of the language, the music of the language, the propulsion of it. I just loved it, even at that early age. And he read Yeats to me first when I was 11.
Hmm.
I still remember the opening stanza of Prayer for My Daughter, and those rhythms. I've walked and prayed for this young child an hour, and heard the sea wind scream upon the tower and under the arches of the bridge, and scream in the elms above the flooded stream. Those rhythms, they sort of stayed with me for the rest of my life. And I wanted to be a poet, and I'm not sure, I was that great at it, but I loved it. And so when I started writing for magazines, because I had to make a living, I wrote as lyrically as I could. And when I decided that I really, really also wanted to write novels, I was about 11 then too, when I first got exposed to fiction that kind of went through my skin to my heart. I thought, if I'm going to write prose, I want to write as lyrically as I can get away with. The novelists that I loved, the fiction writers that I loved, were all extremely lyrical, extremely musical. And So, I sort of put as much poetry as I can into my work, even the prose and the fiction, and sometimes even insert a few poems in there if I can get away with it. So
Yeah,
that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
that's fantastic. Well, I did make a note here that your descriptions of the natural world just glow from within, and I mean that because so often I'm just stunned by your ability to describe nature in ways that just sort of glow with glow from within, right? And I think that it's poetic in its own way, poetry within the prose, I want to say, and it's wonderful. So
Thank you.
keep at it.
Hey.
What was I going to say here? And just kind of to expand on that a little bit, what is the general connection between poetry and your fiction writing? I mean, or I should say, how does, and you just kind of mentioned that a little bit, but how does poetry inform your fiction writing? And I think I've heard
Yeah.
you talk about like when you search for that first line, you search for something lyrical. And so can you kind of expand?
Yeah. Well, that was really interesting. I mean, um, I don't, I think because I came up as a poet first,
Mhm.
uh, when I sat down to write my first novel, I didn't want to plan. I didn't want to have a plot. I didn't want to outline. And I think there are two reasons. One is that I had to make a living being a nonfiction writer for many years, writing for magazines. And I wrote nonfiction books that came out of those articles. I always knew what was going to happen next in those stories, and I knew the ending because they happened. So when I sat down to write fiction, I didn't want to know. I wanted it to be like putting on a river, a narrative current, traveling that narrative current into new territory where I'd never been, no one had ever been before, come around a tight bend on this river, in this gorge, and maybe see a mountain lion or a waterfall. I wanted to have as much fun as my reader. So that was one reason. But the other reason was because I'm really much more concerned about the sound of the language and about the images and how they come at me as I write them and at the reader. And so these are concerns that are really, I think, more about poetry than about prose and fiction.
Mhm.
I didn't really care what happened as long if I was enchanted by the language and the music of it,
Mhm.
the lyrical flow of it. I didn't really care what happened with the plot. I just let the characters run, and they did what they did. But I found that I had to be enchanted with the music of the language first. So I always start with the first line, whose music I love,
Yeah.
or it really intrigues me, and that is sort of um, inseparably entwined with whatever image or mood is there. So it's like a song, and if I'm so enchanted, then off we go.
Yeah.
And I follow one line into the next, and it's all by ear, by the sound of it. So yeah, I think my first love is still poetry, and I think my concerns are more poetic than they are, about fiction. Or
Yeah, and I think it's totally true that if you're moved as the writer by the words, most surely the reader will be moved as well.
yeah.
I think
And
that's
then you mentioned about the dog stars. So I sat down to write this. This was my first novel. I'd been wanting to do this my whole life. I'd been writing for Business Week. And I didn't want to. I'd followed an editor there, and he said, "Hey, do you want to write for Business Week?" I said, "No."
yeah,
Why? Because it's Business Week. He said, you can write about anything in the world you want, just put a pie graph in there. And you can put a pie graph in anything, there's dollars and cents everywhere. So I wrote it. I had a lot of fun, but I'd saved up enough money. I was 50 years old. I went to the coffee shop to sit down and write my first novel. And I started, I think I keep the beast running. I keep the low lead on tap. I foresee attacks. A few lines later, my name is Hig, one name, Big Hig, if you need another. If I ever woke up crying in the middle of a dream, and I'm not saying I did, it's because the trout are gone, every one. And the sound of that, the what it sort of implied, I sort of sat up, my ears swiveled forward like a dog,
hmm
excited, and off we went. So I wrote the book in like 7 months. I got to the last page, and This is the craziest thing about fiction and what I love about it, and what I love about poetry too. 27 years before on my first assignment for Outside Magazine, which I somehow convinced them to let me do, it was kayaking a first descent of a river way against the Tibetan Plateau in Western Sichuan under the Himalayas.
Wow.
And I thought I would bring a book of Tang Dynasty poetry with me to sort of get the heart of the place. And I've done that ever since. Whenever I travel on assignment, I get a book of poems by an indigenous author, and the terrible thing about that trip was on the training run, way up in the mountains. It began to rain, it flooded, and I was in one of a couple of kayakers, and we're sort of the safety boats. Off the expedition went to train, and one of the rafts flipped. Everybody was out in this flooded river, and a couple of guys went into a log jam, which is like instant death.
Mm.
And I was getting pushed into it too, and I somehow hit the shore and scrambled out. And I hauled one guy off the logs with the other kayaker, and the other guy was stuck. And we tried to get him off. He was really stuck. We put a pulley system on. The river rose over his head. It was like that scene in Sometimes a Great Notion. It was terrible. I was holding him in my arms and trying to keep his head up, and the river rose over him, and he died. And he was on his honeymoon.
Mm.
And I had to paddle across the river and tell his new bride that he was gone.
Jeez.
So the next day, she took his ashes home, and we gathered by the river. And now it was back down again, this beautiful flow, nice rhythm, class 4, nothing dangerous. And we sang Amazing Grace. And I read a poem from that book of Tang Dynasty poetry. It's called 100 More Poems from the Chinese, and it's translated by the marvelous poet Kenneth Rexroth. And then we sort of disbanded, and I was traumatized, and I wrote the story and on and on. But 27 years later, when I got to the last page of the Dog Stars, my hero Hig says, "Oh, and my favorite poem is by Li Shang-yin, and it was written in the 9th century." And it was the poem that I had read to David 3 decades before, and it just kind of landed out of the universe onto the keyboard. I didn't even know that I remembered it. And it goes, "When will I be home? I don't know. In the mountains, in the rainy night, the autumn lake is flooded. One day, we will be back together again. We will sit in the candlelight by the west window, and I will tell you how I remembered you tonight on the stormy mountain." And then I typed the end, and then I started to cry,
Oh,
because it was like,
well,
holy cow.
well, I can vouch for that. I cried too when I got to the ending. So it's
Yeah. So anyway, but what I find what's so interesting, Cliff, is as I write along, all this poetry that I read, because I've read, poetry my whole life since I was a little kid. And my tastes are Catholic, eclectic, I read all sorts of stuff. But I find that lines from the rhythms and cadence of certain lines just they just insert themselves into my prose all the time.
yeah.
And so I'll be writing along, and then there'll be something that harkens to a line in the Four Quartets,
Mm-hmm.
"Fair forward, traveler," and there'll be a line that just has that sound to it.
Yeah, yeah.
Or yeah, it's great. It's sort of like just having this whole repertoire of hit songs in your head.
I mean, I know that when I was reading The Dog Stars, I read it probably 3 times, if not more. Um, Highly recommend the book to everyone out there, but beware, it makes you cry. When I got to the ending, you were frozen for a minute. Sorry, Peter. I got distracted. You were like in mid motion. But when I
Oh
got to
yeah.
that ending, first of all, you don't see it coming. You're going along, and your style of writing in that book is very distinctive. And then you hit this poem at the end, and it just like it punches you in the gut. And it brings it all home so beautifully. So instead of a book ending with the soaring prose, you end it with this simple poem, which somehow just brings it all home and left me thinking for days about the book. And so, yeah, magic, real magic.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
thank you to Li Shang-yin. Rest in
yeah.
peace, a
I've
thousand
looked
years
for her
ago.
works, and I did find a few of them in this book. 300, 300 Tang poems. I don't know if you can see that. I found this.
Oh, yeah. Cool.
Yeah, some
Oh, nice.
there's like 10 of her poems in here. I don't know how good the translations are, but they're in there. Um, and so that leads us into this. I wanted to ask you about Tang Dynasty poetry, and you've talked a lot about it and how much it's been an influence on you. But can you expand upon that? I mean, what does it mean to you? What do you like about it, and how has it influenced you as a writer?
Yeah, sure. So after I came back from that trip, I just started buying, I sort of used that. I pulled the threads in that book of all the authors that Kenneth Rexroth had included, and I started reading them, and I became completely, I was infatuated with these poems, and I was surprised that I hadn't dove in before to that pool of poetry. These guys and women were the original blues men. they um, they were aficionados of loss, and there's a lot of loss in my books, and so I sort of resonate
Yeah.
to. I mean, it's a central theme in most all Tang Dynasty poetry. These and it's very accessible. That the images are often of nature. They're often extremely simple and clear, and in a few lines, they can put you knee deep in a mountain stream
Mhm.
with mist shredding in the trees and then break your heart. And
Mhm.
I just love that about the poems. Li Bai, Wu Wei, Du Fu, Li Shangyin. Um, and I love them so much that I wrote a book a few years ago called The Orchard, which
Mhm.
is about a young woman who is already in her mid 30s, a legendary translator of Tang Dynasty poetry. She has a little daughter named Frith. Her name is Haley, and she is especially her specialty is translation of a woman poet from the Tang named Li Shui, who was a courtier, an advisor to the emperor, and then who left the capital with her little daughter and went to an orchard, exile, self-exile from the capital in Chang'an, went to the mountains to an old orchard and wrote poetry. And so in this book, I had my hero, Haley, recapitulate this journey and sort of move from Denver with her own little daughter to this defunct orchard in southern Vermont
Mhm.
and work on another batch of poems of Li Shui. And so she's translating the poems. It's first person from the point of view of this little 8-year-old girl, which was so fun for me to write. And the book is really simple. It's about the mother and daughter, their dog Bear, their big mountain mutt, and their friend Rosie. And it's full of the poems of Li Shui. Well, Li Shui happens to be fictional. So I had to write all the poems in translation of Li Shui, which was so fun for me because, I got to be a poet. And I was reading The River, which had just come out. I was on tour. I was reading in an old stone library in Crested Butte, way up in the mountains on a fall night, with the stars blowing around, and it was, cold out, and it was packed up in this room. Former senator of Colorado was in there. It was just a hoot, and we had this really fun reading. And afterwards, someone said, "What are you working on now?" And I said, "Well, I just finished the manuscript of this book, The Orchard." And it's about a translator of Tang Dynasty poetry. Blah, blah. Afterwards, a woman came up to me, bespectacled, long gray hair, and said, "I am a translator of Tang Dynasty poetry. I teach at the University of such and such, and that's what I do." And my mouth fell open and I said, "Oh my God,
Oh my God, what
would
you
you vet this manuscript for me? Would you please, I had to write classical Tang Dynasty poems. Would you please read these?" She said, "Of course." So 2 weeks later, I get this email and she said, "These are marvelous. They actually
Oh,
passed." And it was probably the proudest moment of my writing life.
wow.
So I have about 15 of her poems in this book, and I've gotten lots of emails, people saying, I loved her poetry, but I've been looking for her work and her books. I can't
Right?
find them to give you tips. And I have to say, well, I made her up. But I've got one here if you want to hear
Yeah,
one.
yeah, sure. And I was one of those people Googling her, trying to find the poems, and I was like, where is this person?
So at the beginning, this is towards the end of the book, and this is a poem about death, I think.
Hmm.
And it's called Winter Brook. When I climb above the brook, flying from purple cliffs, through the wind in pines, the lonely bell, and cross the creek and climb into the streaming mists and past them, and hear the geese descending in cloud. When I find myself humming, sail returning from distant shore, and feel the cold breath of the snows in the pass, then I will stop before going over and turn, and I will raise this empty wooden cup to you, my dearest companion. How many cups of spring water have we shared? How many cups of wine? Tonight, I will be so far away. We will not light the candles together. Tomorrow, only the sky and the mountains will be between us.
Hmm, that's amazing. You hit all the right elements in there, Peter.
It's so fun to channel. I don't know. It's a very interesting process because I find when I'm writing my own poems, a lot of times, they get bottled up or they run in funny ways, and
Yeah.
uh, but when I'm channeling like Lee Schwer, I actually, I feel that this is a real person who's alive,
Uh-huh.
in the ether somewhere and is speaking, and it's just the most thrilling sensation. It's really great,
Yeah.
and they always feel sort of true when she's speaking, whereas mine maybe don't.
Well, and you talked about loss. For me, that there's always this loss and longing, usually longing for a companion or a friend who's far away. And there's always wine and the moon and the pines and the mountains, and that's one of the things I
Mhm.
love so much about Tang Dynasty poetry, and just that. But yes,
Exactly.
the
You just
loss.
want to you just want to be there and
I know.
that,
It's like I was like earlier. I was
yeah.
reading this poem in the book. He's he finds a cottage and a friend greets him and they come on in and they drink wine together and they sing under the moon and the pines are whispering and it's just like I want to be there on the mountain
I
drinking
know,
wine.
I know. After I read a bunch of
Eating
these, exactly. And then, Basho too, who was, someone that you know very well.
yeah. Hmm.
I'm probably not pronouncing it right. Is it Basho?
Basho.
Uh,
I say Basho.
he was very,
Basho.
yeah, he was very influenced by these guys.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
after I read the Tang poets and then Basho, all I wanted to do was just go on a poetry, you know, tramp, walk, through the mountains and visit
Yeah,
friends, share poems. That's all I wanted to do. I just thought, what a cool life.
right, right. And Basho did that. He wandered the hills of northern
Yeah,
Japan, writing
exactly.
writing haiku and drinking wine of the moon, I suppose.
So great. What
Why
could be
can't
better?
why can't we do that today? What's up with
Why
that?
can't we? What the heck? So listen, another guy whose poetry I love, was very influenced by the Tang Dynasty poets was W.S. Merwin.
Yeah, yeah,
And I thought I have one like 6-line poem here if you'd like to hear it, that
yeah,
it's a direct genetic descendant from these poems.
yeah.
And it's called Dusk and Winter, and it's in his collection called Migrations.
Mhm.
I've always loved this poem, especially the last couple lines, and it's only 6 lines. The sun sets in the cold without friends, without reproaches after all it has done for us. It goes down believing in nothing. When it is gone, I hear the stream running after it. It has brought its flute. It is a long way.
Wow. Totally. I can totally see the connection. Yeah.
It's like,
The
yeah,
stream, the flute, it's a long way. I mean, the longing again.
running at, ah,
Yeah.
beautiful, beautiful,
Beautiful.
beautiful.
Well, and that leads me to this point where I wanted to ask you about beyond Tang Dynasty poetry, what are some other poets or poems that have influenced you? And I noticed I'm currently reading The Last Ranger, which I am absolutely loving, by the way. But and I noticed that you have a poem in here by Robinson Jeffers. Well, not a poem, but you have a line from a Robinson
Oh,
Jeffers.
Hurt Hawk. Yeah,
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 Herd Hawk.
yeah.
So I was kind of curious about that and how that ended up in there.
Well, I loved Robertson Jeffers' poetry for decades. I read him a lot. He was really an interesting cat. He built his own little stone house up in the hills above the
Mhm.
on the Central California coast. He was a real loner, and but he was had this deep, deep connection to the hills, the coast, the ocean, the animals, the birds. And so I felt like he was sort of a brother, a soul brother,
Yeah.
brother from another mother for me. And he wrote a very weird book called a long, long narrative poem called The Double Axe about. He was very anti-war. He was a um, you know he was one of the few people who spoke out against the Second World War.
Mhm.
He was a conscientious,
Okay.
yeah, um, so objector, but he wrote this weird book about a guy who comes back from the war and to those hills, to the ranch, his father's ranch, and he's basically dead and he's sort of decomposing as the poem goes on. And
Oh,
the
wow.
heart of that is, in some ways, Jeffers' way to communicate his repugnance with the war.
Mhm.
But he also wrote just beautiful books about, a hawk, for instance,
Mhm.
uh,
The Dying Hawk, yeah.
or whales
Mhm.
off the coast. And so I always loved him. Um, there when I was first coming up, I was 12, 13, 14. I read a lot of really lush musical poems. Like I read a lot of Wallace Stevens,
Oh, yeah.
and
Yeah.
some of those lines, echo, 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 and whenever I'm writing, it takes a mind of winter, and the snowman, and lines from Sunday morning. Um,
Mhm.
Keats, ode on a Grecian urn. Um, that poem deeply informs the Dog Stars, and there are motifs from that poem that repeat.
Oh,
The
really?
Grecian urn in the Dog Stars is the dog Jasper's quilt,
Whoa.
sleeping bag, which has that pattern of the hunter shooting a pheasant and the
Yeah.
dog.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
We all had that sleeping bag when we were a kid. A lot of us did the
Right,
flannel
right.
bag with the hunter shooting.
Uh-huh.
Um, that is sort of, that's the Grecian urn, because the hunter will never hit the bird and his dog will never die.
Wow.
Uh,
Yeah.
and uh, so it's just interesting how all these poems, inform the work. And I love Jack Gilbert. I love the
Yeah.
simplicity,
Gilbert, yeah,
those
yeah.
poems on the Greek island, the simplicity, the sort of searing pain in those poems. Uh, I mean, well, just so
So
many,
many,
on
yeah.
and on and on and on and on.
Well, I wanted to but getting back to the Jeffers poem for a moment, I couldn't help but notice the parallels between the poem and the narrative in the book. Maybe you're not aware of it, but so you talk about well, the line is "He is strong, and the pain is worse to the strong," which is great. But in the same paragraph, you write about how dignified and patient an animal is, in this case, a wolf, when it comes to dying. And, we've all seen, or experienced dogs when they're dying, they want to go and they want to hide away and die in a natural, dignified way. Um, and I love this line in the Jeffers poem, how he writes of the hawk returning in the evening to ask for death, but not like a beggar. Um, and you're kind of talking in the book about the
Right.
wolf. Just he's laying in the field. You can see the glint of sunlight in his amber eye, and he's just waiting for what's going to happen naturally, and that's his dignified death. And to them, it's just part of the process of living. And that's captured so beautifully in that one passage, which so reflects this Jeffers poem as well.
Robertson Jefferson, that poem probably did everything I was trying to do in a it's doing everything that, in one page, he's doing everything that I was trying to do in a 300-page novel. That's the power of poetry, it's
Right,
like
right.
it's so
And
distilled.
and it goes back to
It's
the sort of description of the
it's
book,
kryptonite.
Kryptonite. Yeah, like in the description of the book, you talk about your main character, Wren, who is an enforcement ranger in Yellowstone National Park who likes wolves better than most people. And then Jeffers goes on to say in his poem, I'd sooner, except for the penalties, kill a man than a hawk. So again, this sort of beautiful synchronicity between the poem and your book.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for bringing to light the sort of parallels between the Jeffers poem and the books. A lot of times we don't know what we're doing. The French readers are so passionate and they're so sort of, they'll ask all sorts of questions like, the recurring motif, light motif in the dog stars of the and how did you, and I always go,
I don't know.
well, I just wrote the book. I don't ask me, kind of thing.
Right.
But I love it when someone discovers, a close connection. And that poem was a big influence on me. I really love that poem, and I sort of feel the way Jeffers does, and that could more easily talk or a dog or
Yeah.
um,
A fun question. I had a fun question related to the Last Ranger. Of your two main characters, Ren
yeah,
and Hilly, who would most likely be the one to carry around the Jeffers poem in their backpack?
definitely Hilly. Hilly can't stand people. She's really a
That's what I thought.
uh,
Yeah. She's the one who could more
yeah, I mean,
easily.
Hilly studies wolves, and she loves her wolves, and she really can't stand most people, and I get it,
She's yeah, she's such a great character. Yeah.
she's a misanthrope through and through. Yeah, yeah.
Cool, cool. Okay. Well,
I remember this one. There's a scene in The Last Ranger where the poor campground host, his wife, has left him for a charismatic mountain man
yes.
who wears elk hide, thinks he's back in the uh, and he's kind of crying and moaning to Hilly, who's watching wolves through her scope, and he's sitting on a rock, and she says, you know, um, why don't she's the alpha wolf here? Why don't you just both be her male companions? That's what wolves do. It could work.
Right, right.
It's great.
Yeah, it is great. Yeah.
She sees everything a wolf lens. I love it.
Through the eyes, the amber eyes of a wolf. Yes, I love it.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about. I
The
know
amber eyes of a wolf,
the
exactly.
amber, yes, with the sun glint in it. I love it. Well, is so I just kind of the wrap up because I know we're having trouble with the connection. But any news for Peter Heller and what's next for him, or and what do you got planned next?
Scott is going to start filming the dog stars in April in the Dolomites in Italy.
Ridley Scott.
And Paul Mescal, the new Gladiator, Gladiator 2. Yep. And Paul Mescal, who's starring in Gladiator 2, he's going to be Hig, if I'm allowed to say, so I probably can't, but they've cast a wonderful female actress to be Seema.
Oh, wow.
And so I mean, it's supposed to be shooting in a few months. It's very exciting.
In the Dolomites in Italy. Wow. That's exciting. I can't wait.
Yeah, yeah, me too. Ridley Scott's the bomb, it's going to be fun.
Yeah, he's hot right now. You said you're working on a new book?
Yep. And so I'm here, I go surfing early in the morning and then I come back to this house, which we've had for a long time, and just work for a few hours. And it's really quiet. It's beautiful and a lot of colorful birds flying around. And love
Excellent.
it.
Well, before you go, do you want to tell our listeners a little bit about Burn, just a sort of quick pitch?
It's about two lifelong friends. They grew up in southern Vermont as friends, in and out of each other's houses, helping each other get the wood in, sugar, crushes on the same girls. They're like brothers. And now in mid 30s, one has teaches at UVM, one has moved to Denver to be a woodworker, and they meet every year to go hunting or fishing in the fall. And this year they're moose hunting way up in northern Maine, that big timber country lakes and mountain ranges where you can drive for hours and not see anybody. And they're moving camp after 5 days. They come on a bridge. They have to cross a river. They come on a bridge that's been blown, as in blown up.
Wow.
Need gas. They backtrack to a little village and it's been burned to the ground. And they soon come to realize that Maine has seceded from the Union since they've been gone. And
Mm.
they're in the middle of a crazy civil conflict. And that's how it starts.
That sounds like another movie in the making.
Yeah, exactly. I know.
Well, Peter, I'll let you go. I've held you long enough. Thank you so much for doing this. You've been a wonderful guest.
That would be great. So much for having me. What a pleasure, Cliff. And
My
thank you again for the haiku.
Oh, my pleasure.
You're
Anytime.
a wonderful haiku poet. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
And you're a wonderful author and friend and person, and I love you so much, Peter. Thank you so much.
Likewise. Hey, take care. Hey, good luck with the acting too. It's so fun to see the clips.
Yeah, yeah.
Facebook and stuff.
I just did something this weekend, which was kind of fun. So that's coming. And yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. And your wife is an actor too, right?
Yeah, she's been an actor. I think she's sort of phasing out of it, but she did it all her life. Yeah, she loved it.
No, there's got to be a place for her in the Dog Stars. Come on, Peter.
I know, I know, I know. One of the attacking Mongols, I
Right,
think.
right. I love it. Yeah.
Cool.
Well, enjoy the
Cliff,
rest.
what a pleasure. Thank you.
My pleasure too, Peter. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your time in Mexico, and we'll see you soon.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you real soon right here on Poetry Passages. Bye.
Bye.